The mist came first, as it always did in that country of water and shadow, drifting low across the marshes before the sun had fully climbed above the cypress line. It moved without hurry, the way most things moved, in Barataria Bay, curling between the black knees of the trees that stood half-drowned in brackish water, settling over channels so narrow and so tangled that a man who did not know them might paddle for a lifetime and never find his way back to open sea. Lantern light, where it existed at all, hung low and orange against that fog, glimmering on the surface of still water like something borrowed from a dream rather than placed there by human hands. There were no roads into this country. There were only the bayous, the shallow inlets, the long fingers of water reaching inland from the Gulf, and the silence that lived between the call of one heron and the splash of an alligator sliding from a mud bank into the dark. It was here, in this territory, the maps of the young United States barely acknowledged, that a name began to move through the taverns and counting houses of New Orleans in the early years of the 19th century. A name spoken sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with something closer to reverence, though few who spoke it could have said with certainty where the man behind it had come from or what precisely he intended to become. The America of those years was still young enough to feel unfinished, a nation stitched together from older claims and older grudges, its borders drawn more in ambition than in fact. New Orleans itself had changed hands twice in living memory, passed from French control to Spanish and back to French again before the ink had dried on the sail that brought it, along with the whole vast Louisiana country, into American possession in 1803. The city that resulted from all this passing back and forth was neither quite French, nor quite Spanish, nor quite American, but something stranger and richer than any single flag could contain. A place where the language spoken on one street corner might be Creole French, and on the next, Spanish. The clipped English of merchants newly arrived from the eastern seaboard, all of it threaded through with the rhythms of West African speech, carried by the enslaved and the free people of color, who made up so much of the city's laboring life. New Orleans sat at the mouth of a river that drained half a continent, and everything that moved through that continent, furs from the north, cotton and sugar from the Delta plantations, silver from Mexico, goods bound for or arriving from a dozen empires, passed eventually through her port. She was young, and she was already wealthy, and she was already corrupt in the particular way that wealthy young port cities tend to be. Her official commerce shadowed everywhere by an unofficial commerce that moved just as freely, if considerably more quietly, through the marshes to her south. It was into this shadow economy that Jean Lafitte stepped, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was from this shadow that he seemed to materialize. For the historical record concerning his origins is a strange and unsatisfying thing, full of gaps that no amount of careful searching has ever quite managed to close. Some accounts place his birth in the French port city of Bayonne, sometime in the late 1772 or early 1782, the son of a merchant family with connections to the sea. Other accounts, less certain but persistent enough to have survived, suggest roots in Saint-Domingue, the French colony that would soon become Haiti, torn apart in these very years by a revolution of the enslaved that sent waves of refugees, white and free-colored alike, fleeing toward the ports of the Gulf Coast, New Orleans chief among them. Still others have proposed origins in Spain, or suggested that the man history remembers as Jean Lafitte was in fact assembling an identity from pieces, borrowing a name, a birthplace, a family history that suited the moment rather than reflecting any single fixed truth. What can be said with more confidence is this: by the time Lafitte appears clearly in the documentary record, in New Orleans in the first decade of the 19th century, he is already a grown man, already possessed of the manners and bearing that would later be remarked upon by those who met him. a certain elegance, a fluency in several languages, way of carrying himself that suggested education and even refinement, qualities that sat uneasily alongside the trade he had chosen, or that had perhaps chosen him. He was said to be tall, dark-haired, with an olive complexion that spoke of Mediterranean or Caribbean sun, and eyes that those who left descriptions could not quite agree on the color of, though all agreed there was something arresting in his gaze, something that made men trust him against their better judgment. He arrived, in other words, from nowhere in particular, which is to say, he arrived the way so many did in that era of revolution and displacement, when the collapse of one empire's colonial holdings could send a man across an ocean with nothing but his wits and whatever connections he had managed to preserve. And in New Orleans, a city built almost entirely on the trade, in things that were not supposed to be traded, a man with wits and connections and no fixed history behind him could make of himself very nearly anything he chose. The business he chose, or that circumstance handed to him, was smuggling, though the word itself does little justice to the scale and sophistication of what the Lafitte brothers, Jean and his older sibling Pierre, would eventually build along the marshy edge of Barataria Bay. To understand why smuggling mattered so much to a city like New Orleans, one has to understand the peculiar bind in which American commercial law had placed her merchants. The United States, still finding its footing among older and more powerful nations, had imposed tariffs on imported goods that many in New Orleans considered punishing, tax on the very trade that gave the city its reason for existing. At the same time, the ongoing wars in Europe and later the American embargo policies meant to keep the young nation out of foreign conflicts had disrupted the normal channels of Atlantic commerce so thoroughly that goods which should have arrived through legal ports simply did not arrive at all, or arrived so late and so expensively taxed that ordinary households could not afford them. Into that gap stepped the smugglers of Barataria, and into that gap, with particular skill, stepped Jean Lafitte. The bay itself provided nearly perfect cover for the operation that grew up around it. Barataria was a maze of shallow waterways, sandbars, and hidden channels that shifted with every storm. Territory that only long familiarity could navigate with any confidence, and which larger naval vessels, the kind the United States government might have sent to interfere, could not enter at all without running aground. Ships bringing in goods, some of them legitimate cargo, more of them prize goods taken under letters of privateering commission from various governments, and no small amount of enslaved people brought in defiance of the federal ban on the international slave trade that had taken effect in 1808. And their cargo would be broken down and ferried inland through the marshes on smaller, flatter boats built for exactly this purpose. On Grande Terre, an island at the mouth of the bay, and at other points scattered through the marshland, warehouses rose from the mud on pilings, long, low buildings roofed in cypress shingle where goods waited to be sorted, counted, and priced before making the final leg of their journey toward the city. It was, in its way, a remarkably organized business, run with the same careful bookkeeping and attention to reputation that any respectable merchant house might have employed, except that its ledgers recorded transactions the law of the land expressly forbade. Buyers came from New Orleans itself, sometimes traveling openly by boat down through the bayous to inspect the goods firsthand, sometimes sending agents to negotiate on their behalf, for it was widely understood and widely tolerated that some of the finest silks, the best Spanish silver, the most reliable supply of enslaved laborers, and 100 other goods besides could be had at Barataria for considerably less than the legal market demanded, tariffs and prohibitions notwithstanding. The people of New Orleans, from the wealthiest planters to the poorest laborers, understood perfectly well where such goods originated, and largely did not care. There is a particular tolerance that develops in port cities toward the trades that keep them comfortable, a willingness to look past the source of a good bolt of cloth or a fair price on coffee, so long as the goods themselves arrive as promised. Lafitte and his associates understood this. Tolerance, cultivated it, and in time came to depend upon it as much as any legitimate merchant depended upon his customers' goodwill. And so, in the fog that clung to Barataria's channels through those early years of the century, a quiet empire took shape, built not on conquest or on any flag, but on the simple, patient exploitation of a gap between what the law forbade and what the people wanted. It was an empire without a throne, run by a man whose own history remained as murky as the water that surrounded his warehouses. A man who moved between the roles of merchant, smuggler, and, when the moment called for it, something closer to a prince of the marshes, deferred to by men far rougher than himself. What none of them could have known, not the smugglers unloading crates by lantern light, not the merchants haggling over Spanish silver, not Lafitte himself, standing at the edge of some hidden inlet with the mist curling around his boots, was how far this quiet trade in forbidden goods would eventually carry him, from the shadowed margins of the law, toward a moment when the safety of the very nation that had branded him an outlaw would come briefly and improbably to rest in his hands. That story would unfold slowly, as these things tend to, through governors and bounties and a British offer carried by ship across dangerous water, through a letter written to New Orleans, and a meeting between a general and a pirate that neither man could have predicted a decade before. For now, though, the fog remained simply fog. The lanterns burned low over quiet water, and Jean Lafitte was still only a name spoken carefully in the counting houses of a city that did not yet know what it would owe him. If you would like to stay for the rest of this story, for the governor's bounty, the British offer, and the strange alliance that would decide the fate of New Orleans, consider staying with the channel, where more voyages like this one are waiting to be told. New Orleans, in those years, was a city that seemed to have been assembled rather than built, layer upon layer, each one left behind by a different hand that had once believed the place was theirs. The French had come first, tracing the crescent of the river with a colonial patience that outlasted their own empire, leaving behind narrow streets and courtyards, ironwork balconies that caught the evening light, and a language that would linger long after the flag above the cabildo had changed twice. Then came the Spanish, who governed with a different rhythm, who rebuilt after the fires that had twice taken the old French quarter down to embers, who left their own stamp in the deep archways and the tiled roofs, in the quiet Catholic processions that moved through streets still muddy from the last rain. And now, in these early years of the 19th century, there was a third layer settling over the other two. American, restless, commercial, eager to make sense of a city it had purchased, almost by accident, in a transaction too vast for anyone in Washington to fully comprehend at the time it was signed. The result was not quite French, not quite Spanish, not quite American. It was something else entirely. A city that spoke in 3 languages before breakfast and settled its disputes in whichever tongue suited the moment. In the markets along the levee, Creole matrons in silk argued prices with river traders in buckskin, while free men and women of color moved through the crowds with a social standing that would have been unthinkable in Philadelphia or Charleston, holding property, running businesses, worshipping in the same cathedrals as the white Creole elite. Even as slavery itself remained the brutal foundation beneath the city's wealth. Enslaved men and women worked the wharves and the kitchens and the cane fields beyond the city's edge, their labor woven into every transaction that took place in the sunlit squares above them. Above the markets, church bells rang out over a city that never seemed entirely certain which century it belonged to, and beneath the surface of its elegant chaos ran currents of loyalty that shifted like the river itself, never quite still, never quite predictable, always moving towards some destination that would only become clear later. It was a city built, quite literally, on water, a low, wet plain squeezed between the great river and the vast, indifferent lake to its north, threaded through with bayous and canals that connected it to a wider world of swamp and marsh, stretching south toward the Gulf. And it was a city built, just as literally, on want. For New Orleans, whatever its cultural riches, had never quite been given what it needed by the empires that claimed it. Manufactured goods were scarce and expensive when they arrived through official channels at all. The Spanish crown, and now the young American government that had inherited its old colonial habits without fully understanding them, imposed duties and restrictions and embargoes meant to funnel trade through approved ports, approved merchants, approved paperwork, an entire apparatus of control that assumed a city could be governed the way a ledger is balanced, with entries and totals that added up neatly at the end of the year. But New Orleans had never balanced neatly, and it did not intend to start now. The truth, understood by every shopkeeper and every plantation mistress and every dock worker along the levee, was quieter and more practical than any law passed in a distant capital. Goods arrived when they arrived from whatever hand carried them, and questions about origin were considered, at best, impolite. Silk stockings from Europe, tools of good English steel, sugar and coffee, and the fine porcelain that graced tables in the Vieux Carré, much of it moved through the city, not because the law allowed it, but because the law had simply been set aside, quietly, by mutual and unspoken agreement between buyer and seller. This was the arrangement beneath the arrangement, the current beneath the current, and everyone in the city understood it, even if no one troubled to speak of it aloud in the presence of a customs officer. South of the city, where the river began to unravel into its delta, and the solid ground gave way to something less certain, lay a country that seemed designed by nature herself to hide whatever needed hiding. This was Barataria, not a single place so much as a region. A great tangle of bay and marsh and cypress swamp, threaded through with channels that shifted with the seasons, where a boat that knew the water could vanish within 100 yards of one that did not. The bay itself opened toward the Gulf through a shallow pass, wide enough for shallow draft vessels, but treacherous to anything larger, a natural filter that let the small and the swift through while turning away the deep-hulled ships of any government that might come looking. Beyond the pass, the land dissolved into something that was neither fully water nor fully earth, more straight trees rising from black water, egrets lifting silently from the reeds, the air thick with heat, and the smell of brackish decay. And somewhere within all of it, hidden along channels that changed their shape with every storm, the warehouses and camps of men who had chosen this country precisely because no one else wanted it. It was into this country sometime in the years just after the American purchase of Louisiana that a man named Jean Lafitte began to establish something that was not quite a settlement and not quite an operation, but a little of both, a loose and shifting community of privateers, smugglers, and freedmen who gathered under his authority with a willingness that seemed to those who observed it from the city almost inexplicable. Lafitte himself was, by the accounts of those who met him, an unusual figure to command such loyalty from men who by nature answered to no one. He was said to be tall, composed, dark-eyed, with the bearing of a man raised in better circumstances than his current trade might suggest, courteous in speech, careful in dress, capable of discussing shipping manifests with a merchant in 1 hour and negotiating the sale of contraband silk with a plantation wife in the next. All without ever raising his voice or losing the calm, unhurried manner that seemed to be his defining quality. Where he had come from before Barataria was even then a matter of rumor rather than record. Some said Bordeaux, some said Bayonne, some said he had been born somewhere in the French Caribbean and had simply drifted north with the tides of revolution and war that had scattered so many like him. What was certain was that by the time New Orleans came to know his name, He had already positioned himself at the exact center of the city's contradiction. A man who moved as easily through the drawing rooms of the Vieux Carré as he did through the swamp camps of Barataria, who was received, however quietly, by merchants who needed his goods, and shunned, however loudly, by officials who were obligated to condemn his trade. He kept a shop, or was said to keep one, in the city itself, a modest blacksmith's forge that served as a convenient front for the finer business conducted in its back rooms, where a customer might purchase not iron tools, but bolts of French lace or barrels of good rum that had never troubled a customs officer's ledger. At his side, and in many ways at the practical center of the entire operation, stood his brother Pierre, steadier, less given to the elegant manner that made Jean such a curiosity to the city's elite, but essential nonetheless, the one who kept the accounts, who managed the warehouses, who handled the daily business of moving goods from ship to shore to market, while his brother cultivated the relationships and the reputation that made the whole enterprise possible. Together, the brothers Lafitte presided over what had become, by the second decade of the century, less a smuggling ring than something closer to a small nation unto itself. A confederation of privateers sailing under letters of marque from Cartagena, a fledgling republic whose independence from Spain gave a thin legal cover to men who otherwise would have been simple pirates preying on Spanish shipping in the Gulf. Alongside the privateers came smugglers whose business was landward rather than nautical, moving the captured goods into New Orleans through the hidden channels of the bay. And alongside both came free men of color, escaped or manumitted, who found in Barataria a rare place where ability counted for more than the circumstances of one's birth, where a skilled navigator or a sharp-eyed lookout could rise in standing regardless of the color of his skin. Though even here, the ugly machinery of the era was never entirely absent. For among the goods moved through Lafitte's channels were at times enslaved people themselves, sold quietly into a Louisiana market, always hungry for labor despite the federal laws that had, by 1808, forbidden the international slave trade outright. It was this last fact, more than any romantic notion of piracy, that tied Barataria so tightly to New Orleans, for the city's plantations depended on a steady supply of enslaved labor that the new federal restrictions had made harder to obtain through official channels, and Lafitte, whatever else his trade encompassed, was a man who understood precisely which shortages could be turned into the greatest profit. The moral weight of this business was not lost on the city even then, though it was a weight most preferred not to examine too closely, so long as the goods kept arriving and the prices remained reasonable, and the man who arranged it all remained as he always did, calm, courteous, and just far enough removed from the transaction to preserve the fiction of his own gentility. By the time the fog lifted fully over Barataria in the mornings, revealing the low camps and anchored schooners that had gathered there under Lafitte's quiet supervision, the arrangement had become an open secret stretching from the swamp to the counting houses of the Vieux Carré. With the particular skill New Orleans had always possessed, that it did not know precisely where those goods came from, or precisely whose hand had arranged their passage through the hidden waters to the south. To understand what Jean Lafitte had built at Barataria, one must first understand the paper that made such building possible, and the strange, thin membrane that separated a privateer from a pirate in those years when nations fought each other as much through private hands. A letter of marque was in its essence a permission slip issued by a government at war, granting a private ship the right to attack and seize the vessels of an enemy nation, to carry those vessels into port, and to have them condemned and sold as prizes through a recognized process of admiralty law. It was, on its face, a simple thing. A government too poor or too stretched to maintain a full navy could deputize private captains to do the work of harassment and plunder in its name, taking a share of the proceeds while the captain and crew kept the rest. Cartagena, in its long and often desperate struggle for independence from Spain, issued such letters freely in those years, more freely perhaps than its treasury could bear scrutiny for, and among the men who came to hold them was Jean Lafitte. Sailing under commissions that named Spanish shipping as fair game, in the name of a revolution taking place hundreds of miles to the south. But paper is only as strong as the willingness of others to honor it, and in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico in the years after 1810, that willingness was thin indeed. A letter of marque from Cartagena meant one thing in a Carthaginian court, and quite another thing entirely when the ship carrying it dropped anchor in American waters with a hold full of Spanish goods and no clear record of where, precisely, on the wide ocean those goods had changed hands. The line between a privateer acting within the bounds of his commission and a pirate acting outside all law was, in practice, a matter of documentation, timing, and the mood of whoever happened to be asking questions that day. Ships that raided far past the boundaries of their commission, that attacked vessels of nations not named in their letters, that failed to bring their prizes before a proper court for condemnation, and instead sold the goods quietly from the back of a warehouse. Such ships operated technically as pirates. Whatever paper they carried folded in a captain's coat. Lafitte's captains were, by the honest reckoning of the law, guilty of this more often than not. The letters from Cartagena were real, but they were also convenient, a legal fiction thin enough to see through and yet substantial enough that a judge inclined to look away might find in them just enough cover to do so. It was this thinness, this deliberate ambiguity, that Lafitte understood better than any smuggler who had worked the Louisiana coast before him. He did not run from the law so much as he arranged himself carefully within its shadows, close enough to darkness to conduct his business freely, close enough to daylight that no one could say with total certainty he had crossed some final, irreversible line. The operation itself, once the ships had returned heavy-laden to the marshes south of New Orleans, ran with a precision that would have done credit to any merchant house in the city proper. The prize goods, silks and satins from Spanish holds, casks of wine, chests of Spanish coin, bolts of fine cloth, enslaved people bought and sold as cargo, in a practice that stained the whole enterprise with a cruelty history has been slow to fully reckon with, were brought first to the warehouses that had risen among the huts and camps of Barataria. Structures more substantial than the setting seemed to warrant, built to hold inventory rather than to shelter men. There, goods were sorted, counted, and assessed, and word was sent north to New Orleans through a network of couriers and rivermen who knew the bayous well enough to travel them in darkness. Auctions followed on a rough but reliable schedule, sometimes held right there in the swamp for merchants willing to make the journey by pirogue and flatboat, and sometimes, more remarkably to those who did not know the city well, held openly within sight of New Orleans itself, under the shade of oaks at a place called the Temple, a low mound left by peoples who had lived along those waters long before any French or Spanish flag had been planted in the mud. Merchants came from the city in numbers that grew with each passing season, drawn by prices that undercut anything available through legitimate channels, since goods that arrived without tariff, without the weight of import duty, could be sold at a fraction of their honest cost and still return Lafitte and his associates a considerable profit. A bolt of silk that might command one price at a licensed shop on Chartres Street could be had for half that sum at Barataria, and the merchants who bought it, respectable men, shopkeepers. Even the wives of officials who should perhaps have known better than to ask no questions, carried it back into the city and sold it again at prices that made everyone along the chain a quiet participant in the arrangement, whether they cared to think of themselves that way or not. So, it is worth pausing here in the slow accounting of how the business functioned to consider what it meant for a city and to resist the easy temptation to sort the story into simple villains and simple victims. New Orleans in those years was a place still finding its footing under American governance. A Creole and Spanish and French city grafted only recently onto a young republic that did not yet know quite what to make of it, nor it of the republic. Prices for imported goods, weighted down by tariffs designed to protect American shipping and American manufacture, that high enough that many households, not merely the wealthy, but shopkeepers, tradesmen, families of modest means who wished for a length of good cloth or a bottle of decent wine now and again, found themselves effectively priced out of goods that Lafitte's warehouses could provide at a fraction of the cost. To such families, the enterprise at Barataria was not theft in any sense that troubled the conscience. It was provision, a shadow economy filling a need the legitimate one left unmet, and Lafitte himself was spoken of in some quarters not as a criminal, but as something closer to a public benefactor. A man who understood what the city required and quietly arranged to supply it. To others, the merchants who paid their duties honestly and watched customers slip away to buy smuggled silk at half the price. The customs officials whose entire purpose for existing was undermined by a smuggling operation too large and too well organized to ignore. The more severe voices among the city's elite, who saw in Barataria a lawlessness that threatened the whole fragile experiment of American governance in a territory so recently and reluctantly annexed. Lafitte was nothing more than a thief with better manners than most. To a man whose charm and good tailoring did not change the fundamental nature of what he did. And there is truth enough in both views to make the matter genuinely difficult, which is perhaps why New Orleans, in its particular wisdom, chose for years simply not to resolve it, allowing the ambiguity to sit unaddressed rather than forcing itself to choose a side. This tolerance, however, was never unlimited, and by the years leading up to 1813, the tension between Lafitte's operation and American authority had begun to sharpen into something with real teeth. Customs officials, whose careers and reputations depended on enforcing the very duties Lafitte's business so thoroughly circumvented, grew increasingly vocal in their complaints, writing to Washington and to the territorial governor with reports that describe Barataria not as a curiosity to be tolerated. A criminal enclave operating within a day's travel of a major American port, as though the laws of the United States held no purchase there at all. Naval officers stationed along the coast found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being asked to suppress an operation that half the city seemed quietly grateful for, and their reports back to their superiors carried the particular frustration of men tasked with enforcing an unpopular law. The governor of the Louisiana Territory, William C. Claiborne, occupied perhaps the most difficult position of all. He had been appointed to bring order and American governance to a city that regarded both with considerable suspicion. A Creole population still more loyal in its habits and sympathies to the old European powers than to the young republic that had purchased them, seemingly as a matter of geography rather than genuine belonging. Claiborne understood that a crackdown on Barataria, however satisfying to Washington, risked further alienating a populace that already viewed federal authority with a wary and unconvinced eye. And yet he understood equally that to permit the operation to continue unchecked was to invite exactly the accusations of weak governance. More, in New Orleans and in Washington both were only too eager to level against him. The calls for a crackdown grew louder through 1812 and into 1813. Editorials appearing in the city's papers demanding that something finally be done about the pirates of Barataria, while other, quieter voices, merchants who bought their wine cheap, families grateful for affordable cloth, hoped rather sincerely that nothing would change at all. It was in this atmosphere of mounting, unresolved tension that the first serious moves against Lafitte's operation would soon be set in motion. A bounty offered, a trap laid, consequences that neither the governor nor Lafitte himself could yet fully foresee. And yet, even as these smaller dramas of customs and commerce played out along the Louisiana coast, a far larger movement was already gathering weight across the ocean, one that would render the argument over smuggled silk and undutied wine almost quaint by comparison. A war between the United States and Great Britain, declared in the summer of 1812 over grievances of trade and impressment and national pride, had been grinding on for 2 years without any decisive turn. And in London, in rooms far removed from the bayous and warehouses of Barataria, men in naval uniform had begun to look southward, toward the mouth of the Mississippi, toward a city whose capture might yet turn the whole war in Britain's favor, and toward a fleet already being assembled that would soon sail for the Gulf of Mexico, carrying orders that would change everything for the smuggler king of Barataria, whether he wished it or not. But in New Orleans, that autumn, before any of that distant machinery had begun to turn toward the Gulf, there was a nearer trouble occupying the governor's desk, and it wore the shape of a man who signed his letters with a flourish and paid his debts in Spanish silver. William C. Claiborne had governed the territory of Orleans since its purchase from France, a careful man by temperament, precise in his correspondence, anxious in his private hours, and he had watched for 2 years as the trade of Barataria swelled beneath him like a tide he could not name in his official reports, without admitting how much of the city's daily bread depended upon it. Silk moved through the parlors of the Vieux Carré that had never touched a customs stamp. Sugar-sweetened coffee in kitchens whose owners would have sworn, if asked, that they bought only from honest merchants. The governor knew better. Everyone who wished to know better knew. For a long while, Claiborne had let the matter rest in that peculiar suspension so common to men who govern places larger than their power to control them. A suspension in which knowledge and action occupy separate rooms, and the door between them stays quietly shut. But pressure builds against such doors. Merchants who paid the tariffs, Lafitte's Brotherhood did not pay, wrote letters of complaint. Federal customs officers, embarrassed by their impotence, wrote letters of their own. And somewhere in the tangle of pride and duty that governs men who hold office, Claiborne arrived at a decision he had perhaps always known he would eventually be forced to make. In the early months of 1813, he issued a proclamation, printed and posted about the city, and read aloud, one imagines, in the flat, civic cadence. Such documents always seem to acquire regardless of the drama they attempt to contain. It named Jean Lafitte directly, not merely the Baratarians or certain smugglers of the coast, but the man himself by name, as the architect of the illegal trade that had made a mockery of the customs house. It offered a reward for his capture, $500, a sum substantial enough to tempt a poor man toward betrayal, though perhaps not substantial enough to tempt anyone who understood what manner of protection Lafitte commanded among the fishermen and boatmen of the Delta, who owed him more in loyalty than any bounty could purchase in silver. The proclamation went up on walls and posts throughout the city, outside the cabildo, along the levee, in the coffee houses, where men gathered to read the news aloud to those who could not. It was, by every measure of colonial bureaucracy, a serious document. It carried the seal of the territorial government. It named a fugitive. It set a price on a man's liberty. And it is here that the story takes on the quality that has kept it alive in memory long after most such proclamations have crumbled to dust in forgotten archives. Because Lafitte, rather than fleeing deeper into the marsh or answering with the sullen silence of a man merely hoping to be forgotten, chose instead to answer in kind, and with what can only be described as a flourish worthy of a man who understood theatre as well as he understood tide tables. Within days, some accounts say within the very same week, though the precise timing has softened with retelling, a second set of notices appeared about the city posted, so the story goes, on the very same posts and walls where Claiborne's proclamation still hung damp with paste cope. These notices offered a reward as well, $1,500, 3 times the governor's sum, for the delivery of William C. Claiborne into the hands of persons unnamed. Whether the notice was truly printed and posted by Lafitte's own hand, or whether it was the invention of admirers eager to embellish an already remarkable feud, the story spread through New Orleans with the speed such stories always travel, gathering laughter in the taverns and grim embarrassment in the halls of government. Men who had never so much as glimpsed the smuggler king found themselves grinning at the image of the territorial governor, priced like cattle and prized at a fraction of what Lafitte, in the counting-house arithmetic of his own estimation, believed himself worth. It was a small thing in the ledger of history, a rumor, a broadside, a jest dressed in the clothing of defiance. And yet, it captured something essential about the man that no formal biography could quite convey. Lafitte did not answer power with submission, nor did he answer it with open violence. He answered it with mockery, precise enough to sting and calm enough to avoid the appearance of outright rebellion. He was, in this gesture, neither outlaw nor courtier, but something the young republic had not yet developed, a proper category for a private citizen who conducted himself in matters of trade and reputation alike, as though he were a sovereign power treating with another. Claiborne, for his part, could not let the matter rest there, whatever amusement it provided to the city's coffeehouse wits. A government mocked in public cannot remain a government for long, and so through the remainder of 1813, the pressure against Barataria continued to build. Correspondence passing between the governor's office and federal authorities, discussions of naval action, of militia deployment, doff the delicate question of how a young nation ought to deal with a smuggling operation that had, by that point, become so entangled with the daily commerce of its largest Gulf port that no clean incision seemed possible without drawing blood from the city itself. The decision, when it came, arrived not from Claiborne's pen alone, but from the combined will of federal customs officials and naval officers stationed along the coast. And in November of that year, the order was given. An expedition would sail into the marshes and disperse, once and for all, the nest of smugglers that had made Barataria synonymous with contraband. The raid itself, when the ships came, unfolded with less drama than the proclamations that preceded it, though no less consequence for those caught within its reach. American gunboats moved through the shallow channels toward Grande Terre, the low island that served as Lafitte's principal anchorage, its warehouses stocked with goods awaiting distribution, its wharves lined with vessels of every description, prize ships taken under privateering commissions of questionable legitimacy, fishing boats belonging to men who had no stake in smuggling at all, and the larger craft that carried the true weight of the illegal trade. Word of the approaching force had traveled ahead of it, as word always seemed to travel ahead of any move made against Barataria. And by the time the American vessels arrived, much of value had already been spirited into the deeper marsh, into channels no chartmaker had ever properly rendered, where pursuit became a game no outsider could hope to win. Still, the raid was not without result. Ships were seized, warehouses were searched, and their contents catalogued or carried off. A number of men were arrested. Lesser figures in the organization, boatmen and clerks, and a handful of the captains who commanded Lafitte's smaller vessels and brought back to New Orleans to face the halting machinery of territorial justice. There was a tense standoff at the edge of the island. Accounts suggest a moment when armed men on both sides stood close enough to see one another's faces across the water, close enough that a single misjudged word or gesture might have turned the entire affair into something bloodier than either side intended. But no such word was spoken, no such gesture was made. The moment passed, as such moments so often do, into the safer category of things that almost happened, and the American force withdrew to the city with its seized ships and its handful of prisoners, its raid concluded, its principal quarry once again slipped from the net. Lafitte himself was not among the captured bling. He was, by most accounts, elsewhere on the island's periphery when the ships arrived, or perhaps already departed toward one of the countless hidden anchorages that honeycombed the delta, a man who seemed, throughout this entire period, to possess an instinct for absence precisely when absence was most required. And an instinct so consistent that it invited the suspicion, never quite proven, that someone within the customs house or the governor's own circle carried word to Barataria before the ink of any order had properly dried. Coupler. In the aftermath, the arrested men were brought before territorial courts, and here the story reveals something of the peculiar standing Lafitte occupied in the imagination of the city that claimed to be hunting him. Juries composed of New Orleans citizens, men who bought Barataria's silk, who drank Barataria's smuggled wine, who understood perfectly well what portion of the city's prosperity flowed from the very trade the government now prosecuted, proved reluctant to convict. Charges were dismissed or reduced. Men walked free who might, in a city less entangled with the trade in question, have faced graver consequence. The raid that was meant to demonstrate the government's resolve succeeded instead in demonstrating something closer to the opposite, that Barataria's commerce had woven itself so thoroughly into the fabric of New Orleans life that no court composed of the city's own citizens. This was the strange country Lafitte inhabited through those years, a man proclaimed outlaw by government decree, and yet defended, protected, and quietly celebrated by the very population that government claimed to serve. He was watched, certainly. His movements were known, or believed to be known, to men who might have arrested him a dozen times over had the will to do so matched the rhetoric of the proclamations. And yet he remained, moving between his island stronghold and his quiet dealings in the city itself, neither fully criminal nor fully citizen. A man the young republic seemed unable to decide what to do with, caught as it was between the letter of its own laws and the plain fact of what those laws could not, in practice, accomplish against a man so deeply rooted in the economic life of the place he was accused of corrupting. And so the matter rested, unresolved, through the early months of 1814. Claiborne's proclamations gathering dust alongside Lafitte's mocking counter-notice. The courts unwilling to convict, the raid's damage already quietly repaired through channels only the bayou itself seemed to fully understand. But rested is perhaps too gentle a word for what was in truth only a pause, because far to the north and east, in the corridors of a war that had simmered without resolution for 2 years, talk had begun to turn toward the Gulf, toward New Orleans, toward the mouth of the great river and the wealth that passed through it, and that talk, dark, carried first in whispers among merchants and sailors, then in firmer rumor among the fishing communities of the Delta, had already begun to drift southward into the marshes of Barataria, where a man who had spent 2 years evading his own government's bounty was about to be offered something far larger and far more dangerous than any reward Claiborne had ever dared to post. By the late summer of 1814, the war that had begun 2 years before as a dispute over trade and impressment had settled into something larger and more patient, the kind of conflict that no longer needed a single battlefield to sustain itself, but instead spread outward across oceans and coastlines like a slow tide finding every low place it could fill. In the north, armies had traded ground along the Canadian frontier, with neither side gaining lasting purchase. Along the Atlantic seaboard, British ships moved with the confidence of a navy that had spent a generation mastering the world's waters. And in August of that year, that confidence had been given terrible expression when soldiers marched into Washington itself and left the president's house. The news of it traveled slowly, as news did then, carried by ship and rider through weeks of transit before it reached the delta towns and river ports of the Gulf. But when it arrived in New Orleans, it arrived with a particular weight because the city understood in the way that port cities always understand such things before they are announced. That the war's next chapter would very likely be written on its own doorstep. New Orleans held a value that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with geography. It sat at the mouth of a river that drained half a continent, the artery through which the grain and cotton and timber of an entire interior found its way to the sea. And whoever held that mouth held, in effect, a hand around the throat of American expansion. The British High Command understood this as clearly as anyone in Washington did. A force gathering in the Caribbean, drawn from veterans of the Peninsular campaigns against Napoleon, hardened men accustomed to victory, had begun turning its attention toward the Gulf Coast with the quiet deliberation of an army that believed its object nearly within reach. To take New Orleans would be to sever the Western Territories from the Atlantic states as surely as a blade separating a limb from a body. And there were officers in that gathering fleet who spoke of the city not as a target to be attacked, but as a prize already halfway won, requiring only the right approach and the right allies among the tangled waterways that guarded its southern flank. It was in service of that approach that two officers of the Royal Navy, dressed in clothes meant to soften their bearing, but unable entirely to disguise the discipline in how they carried themselves, arrived by boat at the edge of Barataria in the first days of September, seeking an audience with the man who ruled its channels. The bay received them the way it received everything, without ceremony, the water flat and pewter-colored beneath a sky heavy with the promise of afternoon rain, the air thick with the smell of salt marsh and drying nets. They came ashore at Grande Terre under a flag of truce that meant little in a place with no formal government to honor it, and they were received not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular watchfulness of men who had built an entire enterprise on knowing. Lafitte met them in a low-beamed room near the harbor, a space that served as both office and armory. Charts, pinned along one wall beside cutlasses, hung in careful rows. The furniture, simple but not crude, chosen by a man who understood that appearances mattered even in a smuggler's kingdom. He wore, by every account that survives of such meetings, the same unhurried composure that marked him in every transaction, a dark coat well-tailored despite its wear, his manner courteous in the way of men raised to commerce rather than combat, his eyes doing the work that his expression declined to do. The officers came with an offer that had been considered carefully before it was ever spoken aloud. They offered money, $30,000, a sum vast enough to unmake a man's fortune in either direction depending on what he did with it. They offered land, promises of estates once the campaign concluded and the territory changed hands, the kind of generational wealth that no privateer's raid could ever match. And they offered rank, a captaincy in His Majesty's naval service, a commission that would transform a hunted smuggler into a recognized officer of an empire that did not concern itself with the opinions of governors in provincial capitals. In exchange, they wanted what only Lafitte could give: safe passage through the bayous and channels that guarded the western approach to New Orleans, guidance through waters that had drowned more careless pilots than anyone in the Delta cared to count, and the cooperation of the men under his command, whose knowledge of those marshes was worth more to an invading force than any map drawn in London. It was by any measure an extraordinary proposition, an empire courting a fugitive, treating with a man that the very government he had once served now hunted with printed bounties, offering him in a single conversation more security than a lifetime of careful smuggling could provide. And Lafitte, for his part, gave them neither the answer they wanted nor the refusal they might have expected from a man of lesser patience. He listened. He asked questions that revealed little of his own thinking while drawing out more of theirs. Questions about troop numbers, about timing, about the disposition of ships already moving toward the coast. each inquiry phrased with the mild curiosity of a merchant assessing risk rather than a conspirator weighing betrayal. He spoke of needing time to consider terms of such magnitude, time to consult with the men whose loyalty made his position possible in the first place, time that any reasonable negotiator would understand a man in his position required. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of quiet delay, the kind of stalling that reveals itself only in retrospect as strategy rather than hesitation. Lafitte gave the officers lodging for the night, treated them with the courtesy due to men who had, after all, come under a flag of parley, and sent them away the following day with vague assurances and no binding commitment, a response calculated to buy precisely what he needed most in that moment, which was not money or land or rank, but simply more time to understand which direction the wind of the war was actually blowing before he committed himself to either side of it. Because the truth of his position, considered honestly in the quiet hours after the British boat had disappeared back across the bay, was more precarious than any bounty notice had ever made it. He was a man without a country, in any sense that mattered to the powers, now converging on his waters. The American government that claimed the coastline he operated from had priced his capture and burned his warehouses, had sent naval expeditions to root out his settlement as though it were a plague rather than a population of fishermen and smugglers trying to survive on a hostile shore. He owed Claiborne's Louisiana nothing but grievance. And yet, the British offer, for all its glittering promise, carried its own particular poison, because an empire that would pay a smuggler's fortune for his cooperation today was an empire that would show him no particular mercy once his usefulness had ended. Once the marshes had been crossed and the city taken, and the men who had guided that crossing were no longer needed for anything but silence, Lafitte had not survived as long as he had by mistaking a temporary alliance for a permanent one, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent years reading the true intentions beneath diplomatic language, that an empire's gratitude toward the tools of its conquest rarely outlasted the conquest itself. There was also, beneath the calculation, something harder to name, and perhaps harder for the man himself to fully acknowledge, a question of belonging that no amount of gold could entirely answer. Whatever grievance he held against the American authorities, whatever indignities Claiborne's government had visited upon his settlement and his brother, the Delta itself, the city upriver, with its markets and its cathedral bells and its particular blend of French and Spanish and African and American life, was the only place that had ever felt like something closer to home than any other harbor he had known. To hand its approaches to a foreign fleet was to trade that fragile belonging for a fortune that would follow him into an exile far more permanent than any bounty notice could produce. It was not loyalty in any simple sense. Lafitte was not a patriot in the way the word would later be used to describe him, but it was something adjacent to loyalty, a recognition that survival sometimes required, choosing the devil whose language you already spoke over the one who offered you gold for the privilege of learning it. So he delayed. He let the British officers depart with their offer unanswered, their patience tested against his own, and in the days that followed he turned the matter over with the same careful deliberation he had once given to a shipment of contested cargo, weighing consequence against consequence, aware that whatever he chose in the coming weeks would not simply determine his own fate, but would ripple outward into the fate of a city that did not yet know how much its survival had come to depend on the decision of a man it had spent 2 years trying to hang. The fog that had settled so often over Barataria's channels had never felt more fitting a metaphor for the choice now gathering itself in its waters, a decision that would decide in ways neither empire nor governor could yet fully imagine whether New Orleans would stand or fall, and whether the smuggler, courted by both sides, would end the year a wealthy traitor, a hanged fugitive, or something else entirely. Something the history books had not yet found a name for. The The decision, when it came, arrived without ceremony. There was no council of captains gathered beneath lantern light, no dramatic renunciation of the black flag for the sake of a flag with stars upon it. Jean Lafitte simply sat at his writing table, on grand terre, the British proposals still damp with sea air beside him, and took up his pen. Copied the letters that had come from the officers of His Majesty's fleet, the offers of rank, of land, of $30,000 in gold for a smuggler's cooperation, and he addressed his own letter not to Jackson, whom he had never met, but to Governor Claiborne, whom he had every reason to distrust. It was Claiborne, after all, who had signed the proclamation naming Lafitte an outlaw. It was Claiborne's courts that had condemned his brother. And yet it was Claiborne's desk to which the warning was sent, because there was no other desk in Louisiana that mattered more. And Lafitte understood, with the patience of a man who had spent years reading the currents of power along the Gulf, that petty grievance was a poor currency when set against the arrival of an invading fleet. The letter itself was measured, almost courtly, in its restraint. He explained that British agents had approached him at Barataria, that they had offered him a captain's commission and a fortune in exchange for his knowledge of the bayous and his loyalty in the coming assault, and that he had refused them, not, he was careful to note, out of any sudden devotion to a government that had hunted him, but because he considered himself, whatever his trade, a man of Louisiana, and could not in conscience deliver his own shores into a stranger's hands. He enclosed the British correspondence as proof. He asked, in closing, that his men be spared the noose that had been prepared for them, and that his own past be set aside, at least for the length of the emergency now bearing down upon the city, like weather no one could turn back. The letter travelled up from Barataria by boat and by rider, passing through the marsh country where egrets stood motionless in the shallows, indifferent to the empires colliding around them, and it arrived in New Orleans on a September evening when the city was already thick with rumor. Claiborne read it by candlelight, and those who described the moment afterward, his aide, a clerk, a visiting merchant who happened to be present, recalled that the governor did not immediately know what to make of it. Here was a document that read like loyalty, offered by a man his own proclamations had branded a criminal beyond the protection of the law. It was, on its face, absurd. And yet the details it contained were too precise, too consistent with other fragments of intelligence trickling in from the coast, to be dismissed outright as some elaborate deception. Claiborne called together his advisors, and the debate that followed stretched across several days, conducted in the low, careful voices of men who understood that whatever they decided would be remembered long after the war itself had ended. Some argued that the letter was exactly what it appeared to be, a trap, a piece of theatre staged by a smuggler eager to win amnesty through manufactured heroism, or, worse, a genuine collaboration with the British in which Lafitte would feign loyalty just long enough to lead American forces into confusion while the invasion proceeded unhindered. Others, more pragmatic, pointed out that whatever Lafitte's motives, the letters he had forwarded were real, and real intelligence, however inconvenient its source, was not something a city facing invasion could afford to discard on principle. There was also the uncomfortable matter of the expedition that had already been launched against Barataria weeks earlier. An assault ordered before this letter arrived, intended to finally crush the smugglers' stronghold and seize their ships, an operation that had gone forward with naval gunboats and marines. Burning warehouses and scattering Lafitte's men into the swamps, even as their leader was, by his own account, refusing a fortune from the British Crown out of loyalty to the very government now destroying his settlement. It was a strange and almost unbearable irony, the kind history rarely arranges so neatly, and it did nothing to simplify the decision facing Claiborne and his council. Some of the captured Baratarians were already sitting in New Orleans jails, their trials pending, their fates uncertain, while their commander's letter, sat on the governor's desk, asking for exactly the mercy that had already been denied them by force of arms. The city's merchants, many of whom had quietly profited for years from Lafitte's smuggled goods and had no illusions about where their sugar, their silk, their contraband slaves had truly come from, argued privately that a man who had kept the customs house starved of revenue for a decade could hardly now be trusted as a patriot. Others, more attuned to the arithmetic of survival, understood a simpler truth. New Orleans had perhaps a few thousand poorly equipped militia, an unfinished string of fortifications, and no navy worth the name, while the force gathering against it, if the rumors were accurate, numbered in the thousands of seasoned regulars fresh from campaigns against Napoleon himself. Against such a threat, the offer of several hundred additional men, smugglers, yes, but experienced fighters who knew every channel and shoal between the city and the Gulf, was not something easily refused merely for the sake of wounded civic pride. It was into this uncertain and divided city that Andrew Jackson arrived in early December, having ridden and sailed for weeks from his previous command in Mobile, and the man who stepped off his horse onto the muddy streets of New Orleans bore little resemblance to the popular image of a triumphant general. He was gaunt, worn, thin by dysentery that had plagued him for months, his frame so reduced that observers described him as looking more like a dying man than a commander preparing for battle. And yet, there was something in his bearing, a rigidity of posture, a fixed and unyielding quality in his gaze, that suggested a will unwilling to bend, regardless of what his body might be enduring. He had spent years fighting the Creek Nation in the wilderness of the southern frontier, had buried men under conditions of extraordinary hardship, and had developed along the way a reputation for iron discipline that left little room in the minds of those who knew him for compromise or negotiation. Jackson's first assessment of the Baratarians, delivered in correspondence before he had even fully arrived in the city, was withering. He referred to them, in language that would follow him through the history books, as hellish banditti, men without honor or country, criminals whose offer of assistance he regarded with open contempt. He had, after all, spent his career building an identity around order and lawful authority, and the notion of arming known smugglers, men who had for years openly defied federal revenue laws, who trafficked stolen goods and enslaved persons alike through the marshes south of the city. He made clear to his officers that he intended no partnership with pirates, whatever their professed loyalties. And for a time, it seemed that Lafitte's gamble, so carefully composed at his writing table on Grand Air, might come to nothing more than a footnote of good intention ignored. But New Orleans in December of 1814 was not a city that could afford the luxury of moral clarity, and Jackson, whatever his contempt, was above all else a pragmatist forged by frontier war. As he surveyed the defenses available to him, the scattered militia, the half-finished earthworks, the desperate shortage of flints and powder and trained artillerists, the arithmetic of the situation began, slowly to assert itself against his initial fury. He met with local officials who understood the terrain and the threat far better than he yet did. Men who explained patiently that the waterways feeding into the city, the very channels the British fleet would need to navigate to bring their forces to bear, were known in intimate detail to almost no one except the Baratarians, who had spent years smuggling goods through them under cover of darkness. He learned that among Lafitte's scattered men were skilled artillerists, gunners, whose expertise with cannon exceeded that of most of his own militia, along with flints and powder in quantities the city's own stores could not match. Supplies that had been sitting confiscated in a warehouse since the raid on Barataria weeks before. It was this last detail, perhaps more than any appeal to loyalty or patriotism, that began to turn the general's calculation. Jackson did not soften toward Lafitte out of trust, and he never fully abandoned his suspicion of the man's character. But he possessed the particular discipline of a commander who could set aside personal judgment when the survival of his command required it, and as December's cold crept into the marshes and the British fleet gathered somewhere beyond the horizon, he began quietly and without public announcement to reconsider. He requested a meeting. He did not yet know what he would find in the man he had called a hellish bandit, nor did he know that the smuggler he had condemned in writing would, within a matter of weeks, be standing beside him on the very ramparts that would decide the fate of the city. But the letter that had travelled from Grande Terre to Claiborne's desk had done its slow work, drop by drop, argument by argument, until even a general as rigid as Jackson found himself walking toward a meeting he had sworn only days before he would never allow to take place. The room where they finally met was not grand. It belonged to a merchant sympathetic to the cause, a modest house on Royal Street, where the shutters had been drawn against the afternoon glare and a single lamp burned low upon a table scarred by years of use. The air smelled of tallow and river damp, of tobacco smoke that clung to the drapery, and beneath it all the fainter, more persistent smell of the city itself, salt and mud, and the slow decay of a place built too close to water. Andrew Jackson arrived first, as was his habit, a man who trusted his own presence in a room more than he trusted the words that might be spoken in it. He stood near the window with his coat still buttoned against a chill that was more nerves than temperature, and he did not sit. Those who knew him said he rarely did, in rooms where he had not yet decided who held the advantage. Lafitte came later, and quietly, as though the city itself had absorbed him into its ordinary traffic of merchants and clerks and rivermen, so that no one on the street below could have said with certainty that the figure passing beneath the balconies was the same man whose name had been nailed to walls with a price attached. He wore dark clothing, unremarkable but well made, the clothing of a man who understood that attention, in this moment, was a liability rather than a pleasure. When he entered the room, he removed his hat and inclined his head, not deeply, not with any theatre of submission, but with the exact measure of respect one gives to an equal whose good opinion has not yet been earned. Jackson turned from the window and studied him the way a soldier studies unfamiliar terrain, searching for the places where the ground might give way beneath him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. It was, by every account that survived that evening, a silence, thick with calculation. Jackson had spent weeks building his image of the smuggler king in absentia, a bandit, a thief of the Republic's revenue, a man whose entire fortune rested on the violation of law. He had written as much in dispatches, had said as much to Claiborne, had allowed himself the comfort of certainty that comes easily to men who have never had to look their enemy in the face. But the man before him now did not resemble the caricature. Lafitte's bearing was calm, almost courtly. His voice, when he finally spoke, pitched low and even, the accent softening the English into something that sounded less like a threat and more like an invitation to reason. He did not begin with apology, nor with grievance, though he had grievance enough. The raid on Grande Terre still fresh, his brother still confined, his warehouses still smouldering in memory, if not in fact. Instead, he spoke of the city. He spoke of New Orleans the way a man speaks of a woman. He has loved imperfectly, but completely, acknowledging her flaws without diminishing his devotion. He said that whatever quarrel existed between himself and the government, it was a small thing beside the larger question of what would happen to the city, to its women and its churches and its markets and its narrow candlelit streets, if the British were permitted to take it. He said he had no love for men who wished to plant a foreign flag over water. He had sailed since boyhood, and then, without embellishment, he made his offer. He spoke first of numbers, men who could be gathered within days, seasoned in violence not through malice but through necessity, accustomed to boarding actions and close combat, familiar with cannon, in a way that few of the militia gathering nervously in the city could claim to be. He spoke of flints and powder, kegs of it, enough to supply batteries that otherwise stood half-armed and waiting on promises from Washington that had not yet arrived. He spoke of shot and lead, of muskets taken as prizes and never yet put to use, all of it sitting idle on Grant Air while the city fretted over shortages. And then, more quietly, he spoke of the thing that could not be purchased or requisitioned from any arsenal, his knowledge of the water itself. The bayous that threaded through the marsh, like veins beneath skin, the shallow passages that no naval chart recorded accurately, the places where a barge could move at night unseen by any picket, the places where an invading force might land unnoticed if no one warned the city in time. He knew these waters the way a man knows the rooms of his own house in darkness. He offered that knowledge freely, without condition beyond the one condition that mattered most to him, that his men be pardoned, that the raid be forgotten, that the law that had hunted him be persuaded at last to look away. Jackson listened without interruption, and those who claimed to have witnessed the exchange said his expression, through most of it, remained unreadable. The face of a man weighing a ledger rather than a moral argument. He had built his reputation on decisiveness, on distrust of complication, and here was complication given human shape. A man he had called an outlaw, offering him precisely what he lacked. The general was practical before he was proud. Whatever his letters to Claiborne might have suggested to the contrary, and practicality was already beginning to erode the certainty with which he had entered the room. He asked questions, sharp and specific, about the numbers of men, the condition of the powder, the reliability of the flints, testing the offer, the way a merchant tests a coin for the ring of truth beneath its surface. Lafitte answered each question without hesitation, and it was perhaps this, the absence of desperation, the calm specificity of a man who had nothing to hide because he had already decided what he was willing to give, that began to shift something in Jackson's estimation. There is no verbatim record of the words that closed their arrangement, no transcript preserved by either man, and so what survives is inference built from what followed. But the shape of the agreement is clear enough in its outcome. Jackson would accept the men, the powder, the knowledge of the water, and in exchange he would carry to the governor and to Washington itself the promise that those who served would be pardoned, not merely excused, but formally absolved. Their crimes erased from the record as though the raid on Barataria had never taken place, and the years of smuggling before it had never been more than rumor. It was not friendship that sealed the arrangement. Jackson would never call Lafitte a friend, not in that room, and not for years afterward. And Lafitte, for his part, understood perfectly well that the general's respect, however genuine it might become, was a soldier's respect for a useful instrument, rather than a statesman's respect for an equal. But it did not need to be friendship, it needed only to be sufficient. And it was. There is something almost unbearably strange when it is set plainly beside the customs of the age, in the picture of what that meeting produced. Pirates, deputized by the very republic that had condemned them, standing not in chains, but at gun batteries, defending a city whose laws they had broken for a decade. Men who had run contraband past customs officers by moonlight would soon stand shoulder to shoulder with those same officers' uniforms, aiming the same guns at a common enemy. Was the sort of arrangement that could only emerge from a moment when the ordinary distinctions between lawful and unlawful, respectable and disreputable, had been temporarily suspended by a threat larger than either category could contain. The British did not care whether the men defending New Orleans wore a customs officer's coat or a smuggler's boots, and so for a brief season neither did the men who commanded them. Word of the arrangement moved through the city with the particular speed that scandal always seems to carry, faster than official proclamation, faster even than fact. Some among the merchant class expressed outrage that the government would treat with criminals rather than punish them. Others, more pragmatic or simply more frightened, said nothing against it, understanding well enough that a city defended by pirates was preferable to a city undefended at all. Claiborne, who had authorized the very raid that destroyed Lafitte's stronghold only weeks before, now found himself obliged to sign correspondence recommending clemency for the same men his militia had chased through the marsh. It was the kind of reversal that history does not often record with grace, and yet it happened quietly, in the space of a season, because necessity is a more persuasive author than principle. And all the while, beyond the mouth of the river, beyond the barrier islands and the long grey stretch of the Gulf, the British fleet continued its slow, deliberate approach. Word came in fragments, a sighting here, a rumour there, a fisherman's account of masts on the horizon that might have been dozens or might have been a trick of fog and distance. No one in the city knew precisely when the blow would fall, only that it was coming. The way one knows a storm is coming from the particular stillness of the air before it breaks. Jackson set about fortifying what defences he could, distributing the powder Lafitte had delivered, positioning the guns along the lines he judged most vulnerable. Lafitte, for his part, moved through the city and the marshes beyond it, with the quiet authority of a man who had finally been permitted to serve the place he had always, in his own complicated way, considered home. The candlelight in that merchant's room on Royal Street had long since guttered out, the negotiation concluded, but its consequence extended forward into every day that followed, into the batteries being reinforced along the river, into the muskets finally reaching hands that had lacked them, into the uneasy, unprecedented alliance of soldier and smuggler standing together upon ramparts neither had ever expected to share. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unaware of what had been arranged in a lamplit room, while they sailed closer, the British continued their approach, confident in their numbers, unaware that the marsh they intended to cross so easily now belonged, in every practical sense, to men who knew its every hidden channel better than their own hands. In the days that followed that lamplit agreement, New Orleans began to change in the manner a body changes when it senses a fever coming, slowly at first, then all at once until the whole of it seemed to hum with a low and constant readiness. The city had known threats before, had known the anxious rumors that came upriver on flatboats, and the wilder speculations that traveled faster than any boat could carry them, but this was different. This was a threat with ships attached to it, with real soldiers marching under a real flag. And the difference showed itself in the way the streets emptied of idle men and filled instead with purposeful ones. In the way conversations in the market turned short and practical, in the way even the Ursuline sisters, it was said, began to pray with a new specificity. Along the river, the batteries that had stood half-finished for years, monuments to municipal indecision more than military planning, were suddenly swarmed with laborers. Cannons were dragged from storage and from ships, not yet fully decommissioned, hauled on makeshift sledges through streets never designed for such weight, and set into place along the natural levee with a haste that spoke of how close the danger truly was. Free men of color worked alongside slaves, rented from plantations for the occasion, alongside soldiers of the regular army who found themselves, for once, taking direction from engineers who did not care what color hands moved the earth, so long as the earthworks rose fast enough. The marsh itself became a subject of constant scrutiny, small boats sent out at dawn and dusk to watch the bayous. Sentries posted along paths that a week before had seen no traffic but smugglers and alligator hunters. Officers squinting at maps that Lafitte's men had corrected in places where the official surveys had simply been wrong. It was in this atmosphere, this slow transformation of a city into something more like a fortress, that the Baratarians found their place. They arrived in ones and twos at first, uncertain of their welcome. Despite Jackson's assurances, men who had spent years regarded as criminals now walking toward the very militia companies that had once been sent to hunt them. But necessity has its own diplomacy, and within days the awkwardness had begun to dissolve into something more useful. The Baratarians knew powder. They knew how to load a cannon quickly, how to judge the fall of shot, how to keep a gun firing steadily even when the air around it grew thick with smoke, and the deafening repetition of its own report. These were not skills easily found among militia companies more accustomed to musket drill than naval gunnery. And Jackson's officers, whatever their private feelings about the company they now kept, were not foolish enough to waste such expertise. Dominique Yu, who had commanded gun batteries on Barataria with a precision that had once terrorized merchant captains, found himself placed in charge of 2 cannons at the very center of what would become the American line, a position of such importance that history would later struggle to explain why a pirate had been trusted with it, forgetting how thoroughly the ordinary rules had already bent beneath the pressure of the coming battle. Renato Beluche, another of Lafitte's captains, took a position nearby, and around them the flints and powder that Lafitte had supplied. The very stores that had drawn British attention to Barataria in the first place were distributed among batteries that would have otherwise stood half-loaded. Their guns present but effectively useless without the means to fire them. This was not spoken of loudly, not celebrated with any particular fanfare, but it was understood by everyone close enough to see it. Without the flints and powder from Barataria, several of the American guns would have had nothing to shoot. The elegant symmetry of it, pirates supplying the very material needed to defend against the empire that had once dismissed them as an irrelevant nuisance, was not lost on Jackson, whatever his earlier scruples. And it was not lost on the men who now stood shoulder to shoulder along the ramparts, soldier and smuggler alike, watching the same grey horizon for the same approaching danger. The days themselves passed with a texture that those who lived through them would later struggle to fully convey. There was tension, certainly, but it was not the sharp, immediate tension of battle. It was something slower, more diffuse, the tension of waiting for a storm whose exact arrival could not be predicted, only sensed in the pressure of the air and the peculiar stillness of the birds. The weather in those weeks alternated between damp warmth and sudden chill, fog rolling off the river some mornings so thick that sentries could not see 50 paces down the levee. And on those mornings especially, the waiting grew almost unbearable, every rustle in the reeds sounding like the vanguard of an army, every distant splash sounding like oars. Rumors moved through the ranks with the persistence of insects, difficult to swat down entirely no matter how often officers tried. It was said the British had already landed in overwhelming numbers. It was said they had turned back, discouraged by the marsh. It was said Pakenham himself, the general who had arrived to take command, brother-in-law to Wellington, and possessed of a reputation for near invincibility, had sworn to take New Orleans by Christmas and dine in the city as its new master. Whether or not the rumor was accurate in its particulars, it captured something true about the confidence with which the British approached the campaign, a confidence built on years of victories against Napoleon's armies, and a settled belief that a scattering of militia, slaves, Creoles, and outlaws could not possibly stand against disciplined regulars. It was this very belief, in fact, that would prove the British undoing, though no one on the American side could have predicted it with certainty in those tense December days. What Pakenham's forces did not fully appreciate, what perhaps could not be appreciated by men new to this particular delta, was the strangeness of the ground they meant to fight upon, the way the cypress swamps and cane fields and canals conspired to slow any army unfamiliar with them, and the way that unfamiliarity mattered less to men like Lafitte's Baratarians, who had spent years moving through exactly this terrain in the dark, avoiding exactly the kind of official notice that the British now represented in its most concentrated form. Within the American camp, the diversity of the assembled forces was impossible to ignore and impossible, in those pressing days, to treat as anything other than a practical asset rather than a social complication. There were the Creole militia, sons of the old French and Spanish families, proud and uncertain how much loyalty they truly owed to the American government that had absorbed their city only a decade before. There were the free men of color, organized into their own battalions, fighting for a nation that granted them incomplete citizenship at best, motivated by a complicated mixture of genuine attachment to New Orleans and a hope, however cautious, that valor demonstrated now might translate into some future measure of dignity. There were frontier riflemen from Tennessee and Kentucky, men who had marched for weeks through country as unfamiliar to them as the swamp was to the British, carrying long rifles whose accuracy would prove devastating at range, and carrying with them the particular fatalism of men accustomed to hardship as an unremarkable feature of life. And now there were the Baratarians, former outlaws, whose presence days before would have seemed as improbable as fish walking onto dry land. Jackson himself, a man not naturally inclined toward tolerance of ambiguity, found himself commanding perhaps the most heterogeneous army fielded by the United States up to that point in its short history, and found, too, that necessity had a way of dissolving prejudices that peacetime might have preserved indefinitely. He would later write of the pirates with something approaching grudging respect, careful respect, the respect of a man who had expected less and found more, though in those December days such reflections lay still in the future, obscured by the more immediate business of preparing every gun, every yard of earthwork, for whatever the British intended. The nights in particular carried a strange hush, a stillness broken only by the murmur of men talking low around fires, by the distant calls of night birds in the cypress, by the occasional splash of some unseen creature moving through the black water beyond the sentry lines. Soldiers and smugglers, who days before would have regarded each other with open suspicion, found themselves now sharing coffee and quiet conversation, discovering in the awkward intimacy of shared danger a kind of fellowship that neither side had expected. Some of the Baratarians, it was said, taught the militia small tricks of the swamp, how to read the movement of birds as a sign of approaching boats, how to judge the tide by the smell carried on the wind, small knowledge that seemed insignificant until the moment it mattered. Above them all, the sky continued its slow rotation of grey days and starred nights, indifferent to the plans forming beneath it. Somewhere out past the barrier islands, past the shallow lakes and winding bayous that separated the city from the Gulf, the British fleet continued its methodical approach, ferrying troops toward a landing point that would place them at last within striking distance of the earthworks now rising along the river. They came with confidence, built on empire, on victories won across a continent, unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to believe, that the swamp itself and the men who knew it had already begun to work against them. Though the days passed, each one drawing the two forces closer together across a landscape of cane fields and cypress and slow brown water, the tension mounting not in dramatic spikes, but in a steady, imperceptible accumulation, like water rising behind a levee not yet breached. Dawn came grey and damp over the marshes each morning, mist clinging to the cypress knees, herons rising silent and startled from the reeds, and with each such dawn, the sense grew stronger among those who watched it that the waiting could not continue indefinitely, that somewhere beyond the fog, the tide of the coming battle was already moving toward them. Patient and inevitable as the river itself, and that, soon, very soon, it would arrive. It arrived on the morning of the 8th of January in the year 1815, though those who woke before dawn on the Calumet Plain could not yet have named the hour as history would come to name it, The fog lay low and thick along the Rodriguez Canal, settling into the cane stubble and the ditches, like something poured rather than formed. And the men who stood along the American line, soldiers and militiamen, free men of color and frontier riflemen, Baratarian gunners among them, could see perhaps 30 yards before the world dissolved into grey. Somewhere beyond that, grey and visible but not unheard, came the sounds of an army arranging itself. The clink of accoutrements, the low murmur of orders passed hand to hand, the occasional cough or shifted footstep of several thousand British regulars, waiting for the signal to advance across an open field toward a mud rampart they had been told, by officers who should have known better, would fall easily before disciplined bayonets. The Americans had spent the weeks prior building that rampart from earth and fence rails, from cotton bales in places, from whatever the swampy ground and the urgency of the hour could provide, and along its length the guns had been placed with care. 8 batteries in all, manned by artillerists of varying origin and varying history, and among them, at several of the most exposed positions, stood the men who had come from Barataria. They were gunners by trade in a sense no regular army training could quite replicate, men who had spent years learning the particular arithmetic of powder and range and elevation, not in drill yards, but in the close, urgent business of taking prizes at sea, and Jackson, whatever his early reservations, had placed them where their skill would matter most. Dominic, you commanded one of the most forward batteries, and beside him, and along the line in other positions, other Baratarians stood ready with linstock and rammer, waiting in the fog for a war that had, in truth, already been settled in a treaty signed weeks before in a Belgian city called Ghent, and would not know for some time, the ocean being what it was. Indifferent to the timing of human agreements, the fog held longer than the British commanders had hoped. Sir Edward Pakenham, a general of considerable reputation and considerable confidence, had intended the mist to mask his army's approach until it was too close for the American guns to do much damage. But the morning light rose slowly and the vapor lingered, and there was a strange, suspended quality to those early hours. But both sides of the field of men, standing very still, in a world reduced to sound and grey shape, listening for what could not yet be seen. Then gradually, as the sun climbed further, the mist began to thin, and the American gunners atop their rampart watched it peel back from the field, like a curtain drawn slowly aside, and what it revealed, advancing in the pale light with a discipline that even now, at this distance of years and understanding, commands a certain solemn respect. Quote, was the British Army in full formation, long red lines moving forward across the open ground, colours uncased, drums beating a measured advance, bayonets catching what thin light there was. The batteries opened almost at once. What followed has been described, in many accounts, by many hands, in language that often reaches for drama, the actual event scarcely required, for the truth of it, strict of embellishment, is terrible enough in its plainness. The American guns, well sighted and well served, began to tear into the advancing lines with grape shot and canister at a range that grew shorter with each passing minute, and the British soldiers, trained to hold formation under fire as few armies of that era were trained, continued forward nonetheless. Closing ranks around the gaps torn by each successive volley, the drums still beating, the colours still advancing, until the weight of fire became more than flesh and discipline together could sustain. Dominique Hughes' battery, positioned where the British main assault would press hardest, fired with a rapidity and accuracy that later accounts, Jackson's own among them, singled out for particular note, and the other Baratarian gunners along the line matched that same steady, almost mechanical competence, loading and firing, with none of the disorder that so many had predicted, would attend men once considered no better than outlaws. There is a temptation, in recounting a battle, to reach for the language of chaos and fury and certainly there was noise enough in those hours to justify it. The concussive roar of the cannon, the higher crack of rifle fire from the Tennessee and Kentucky men crouched along the parapet, the screams of wounded men and horses, the shouted orders in English and French, the drums that continued, remarkably, even as the lines they marked grew thinner. But those who survived the day and spoke of it afterward, the immediate horror had receded enough to permit reflection, often remarked instead on a strange, almost dreamlike quality to the experience. The way time seemed to slow and stretch, even as events moved with terrible speed. The way the smoke gathered thick and acrid over the field, until men on both sides fired as much at muzzle flashes as at visible targets. The way discipline, on both sides, held even as the ground beneath it grew soaked and torn. It was not chaos so much as a kind of terrible order, each side doing precisely what training and courage demanded of it. And the cost of that order was measured, within less than half an hour, in a toll that would astonish observers on both sides of the Atlantic for years afterward. British assault, for all its discipline, could not close the distance. Pakenham himself, attempting to rally a wavering column near the American right, was struck and mortally wounded in the field. And with his fall, the coherence of the assault began finally to break. The survivors of those shattered red lines, falling back across ground, now littered with their own dead and dying, in numbers that would come to define the battle in the memory of an entire generation. On the American side of the rampart, the volume of fire slowed only when there was, quite simply, nothing left within range to fire at, the field before them empty of any organized force, littered instead with the debris any such assault leaves behind, and the guns, Baratarian and otherwise, fell gradually silent along the line as officers called their crews to stand down, the smoke drifting slowly off toward the river in the same unhurried way it had gathered. What had taken the better part of a generation of tension between Empire and Republic and weeks of preparation along a muddy stretch of Louisiana cane field was decided in considerably less time than it takes to describe it, a matter of, perhaps, 25 minutes from the first advance to the final retreat. Though those who lived through it would later find it difficult to say with any confidence how long it had actually lasted, time having behaved as it does in such hours according to its own private logic. The American losses were remarkably light, a fact that struck contemporaries as almost providential: a handful of dead, a modest number wounded, figures that seemed scarcely to belong to the same battle as the British toll, which numbered in the hundreds dead and well over 1,000 wounded or captured. A disparity so stark that it would be cited for decades afterward as evidence of what disciplined defense, well-prepared ground, and accurate artillery could accomplish against even the finest infantry Europe had to offer. There was no cheering along the American line, or if there was, the accounts that survive make little of it, dwelling instead on a quieter response, men lowering their weapons, looking out over a field they had just helped to empty of life, the smoke lifting slowly to reveal what the fog and then the fire had obscured. Jackson himself is said to have moved among his men with a kind of grave, exhausted gratitude, and among the Baratarians at their guns there was, by most accounts, little of the swagger that popular imagination has since attached to them, only the same tired, sober quiet that settled over the rest of the line, men who had done with evident skill. A task that offered no particular satisfaction in its completion, whatever relief attended the knowledge that it was, for now, over. The field itself, once the smoke had cleared enough to see it plainly, presented a scene that none who witnessed it described with anything resembling triumph. The dead lay scattered across the open ground in the postures violent death leaves behind, and the wounded, far more numerous, called out or lay silent according to the nature and severity of what had been done to them. And in the hours that followed, under flags of truce exchanged between the two commanders, parties moved out across that ground to gather what could be gathered, the living to whatever care could be offered them, the dead to whatever burial the sodden Louisiana earth would permit. New Orleans itself, the city whose fate had hung so uncertainly in the weeks before, was spared the fire and plunder that had befallen Washington only months earlier, and word of the victory, when it finally traveled the slow distance north and east to a nation not yet certain the war itself was over, would arrive as something very near miraculous, a battle won so decisively at such disproportionate cost that it seemed to confirm something about the young republic's fortune that no formal treaty, however it had already been signed across the ocean, could quite diminish. Along the rampart, as the light faded on that January evening, the guns stood cooling in the damp air, and the fog that had opened the day began gradually to gather again over the marsh, indifferent, as it always had been, to what men had done beneath it. The pardon, when it came, arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet, deliberate weight of paper moving through the machinery of a young government, still learning how to reward those it could not easily categorize. President Madison signed the document in February of 1815, a formal act of executive clemency extended to Jean Lafitte and the men who had fought beside him at Chalmette. And though the language of the pardon was couched in the careful phrasing of law, pardoning them for offenses against the revenue and neutrality statutes of the United States, offenses that had once carried the weight of the gallows, everyone who read it understood what it truly meant. The Republic, having taken what it needed from the margins, was now prepared to forgive the margins for existing. It was an extraordinary reversal when set against the events of only months before. The bounty on Lafitte's head, the raid on Grand Terre, the warehouses burned and the schooners seized, all of it now folded quietly into the larger narrative of the nation's deliverance, as though the intervening violence had never occurred. As though Louisiana's governor and its privateer king had always been allies rather than adversaries circling one another across a swamp. For Lafitte himself, the pardon arrived as both vindication and complication. He had wanted, or claimed to want, precisely this: legitimacy, a clean slate, the right to walk the streets of New Orleans without the shadow of the noose trailing behind him. And, for a time, in the weeks and months after the battle, he seemed to embrace what respectability offered. He was seen in the city more openly than he had ever dared before the war, dining in the better houses, received, if not warmly, then at least without the reflexive suspicion that had once greeted his presence. The merchants who had quietly bought his smuggled goods for years now had reason to acknowledge him in daylight, and the planters who had once demanded his capture found it politic to speak of him, if they spoke of him at all, with a kind of grudging respect reserved for a man who had done the state a service too large to ignore. New Orleans, a city that had always known how to absorb contradiction into its daily rhythms, absorbed Jean Lafitte as well, at least for a season, treating him as a curious hybrid of criminal and patriot, a man whose past crimes had been retroactively transformed into acts of foresight. But respectability, it became clear before long, sat on him the way a borrowed coat sits on a man of different proportions. Serviceable, perhaps, but never quite comfortable, never quite his own. Those who observed him in this period, the brief interval between the cannon smoke at Chalmette and his final departure from Louisiana, described a restlessness that seemed to deepen rather than ease as the months wore on. He had spent the better part of a decade building an empire in the margins, an empire without a flag, without formal recognition, but with its own courts, its own currency of goods and favors, its own laws enforced, not by statute but by the simple mechanics of supply and demand operating outside the reach of customs houses. To live now within the boundaries of ordinary commerce, to conduct business according to the tariffs and regulations he had spent years circumventing, was to live a diminished life, however comfortable its surfaces might appear. The pardon had made him legal. It had not made him tame. There is a particular kind of restlessness that afflicts men who have tasted the freedom of operating beyond the reach of law. And it is a restlessness that respectability rarely cures, however much it may disguise itself as ambition, or as boredom, or as simple dissatisfaction with the pace of ordinary life. Lafitte, in the accounts that survive from those who knew him during this brief interlude, exhibited exactly this affliction. He was a man built for negotiation at the edges of empires, for the particular skill of reading which laws could be bent and which could be broken outright, for the quiet satisfaction of moving goods and information through channels that official ledgers pretended did not exist. Barataria had given him all of this in abundance, and New Orleans, for all its willingness to forgive him, could offer only a smaller, more circumscribed version of the same appetite. He had been an uncrowned prince of the marsh. He was not suited to being merely a respected merchant of the city, however comfortable such a position might have proven for a lesser man. And so, within a year of the pardon that ought to have settled him, Jean Lafitte began once more to look toward the margins. The choice, when it came, was not entirely his own invention. The currents of the Gulf had always been shaped by empires jockeying for advantage, and Spain's grip on Texas, however formally maintained, was as porous as Louisiana's had been before the purchase. An island off the Texas coast, a stretch of coastal marsh, not unlike the one he had left behind, offered itself as the next staging ground, and Lafitte, along with a portion of the men who had followed him from Barataria to Calmette and had found the transition to lawful commerce no more comfortable than he had, began to establish a new settlement there. They called it Campeche, and it rose on Galveston Island in a manner that mirrored, almost exactly, the pattern of Grande Terre. Warehouses for goods that had not paid duty to any government, a harbor for vessels flying letters of marque from a Latin American revolution that existed as much on paper as in fact a loose settlement of privateers, smugglers, and adventurers who recognized in Lafitte the same qualities that had made Barataria thrive. He built, in essence, a second kingdom in the same image as the first, having learned nothing from the destruction of the previous one, except, perhaps, how to build it again more quickly. It is worth pausing over this decision, over what it reveals about the man and about the peculiar limits of forgiveness offered by nations to those who serve them briefly and usefully. The pardon had been genuine, and the gratitude behind it, at least in the moment of victory, had been genuine as well. But a pardon addresses only the offenses already committed. It does not alter the nature of the man who committed them, and it certainly does not supply him with a new set of appetites more suited to a lawful life. Jean Lafitte had spent his entire adult existence, from Barataria to the moment of his rehabilitation, moving through the spaces between empires, exploiting the gaps that formal sovereignty always leaves at its edges, gaps where goods can move without duty. This was not a phase he had passed through on his way to respectability. It was rather the fundamental architecture of who he was, and no formal pardon, however sincerely offered, could retrofit a man built for the margins into a citizen content with the center. There is a kind of person history suggests who exists specifically in the friction between nations, in the disputed borders, the unclaimed marshes, the waters where one flag's authority fades before another's clearly begins, and who cannot, in any meaningful sense, be relocated to solid ground without ceasing to be himself. Lafitte belonged to this category as fully as any figure of his era, and his return to smuggling at Galveston should be understood not as a moral failing so much as a kind of geographic and temperamental inevitability, the same way a fish returned to open water will resume swimming rather than remain in the shallows where it was briefly put on display. He had been useful to Louisiana in a moment of crisis, precisely because he possessed skills and resources that lawful society could not otherwise summon. Cannon, powder, flints, men who knew the marsh and the guns both, and having lent those resources once, at considerable cost to himself. T. He found no reason to remain forever within the boundaries of a citizenship that had never quite fit him in the first place. The years at Galveston unfolded much as the years at Barataria had, though with less duration and ultimately less consequence for the larger sweep of American history. Ships came and went. Goods moved through the settlement's warehouses without troubling themselves over the tariffs of Spain, Mexico, or the United States. Lafitte presided over Campeche with the same blend of charm and calculation that had made Grande prosperous, cultivating relationships with revolutionary agents and opportunistic merchants alike, playing the same careful game between larger powers that had always been his particular genius. But the settlement, like its predecessor, existed on borrowed time, tolerated only so long as it proved more useful than troublesome to the nations whose waters it occupied, and by the early 1822, the pressures that had once destroyed Barataria began to gather again around Galveston. American naval patrols, growing less patient with piracy conducted under the thin cover of Latin American commissions, complaints from merchants whose vessels had been taken without sufficient legal justification. And it is here, in the final years of the Galveston settlement, that the historical record, always somewhat porous where Lafitte is concerned, given his lifelong preference for operating outside the reach of official documentation, begins to thin into something closer to silence. The dates blur, the accounts contradict one another. Some records suggest he burned Campeche himself, rather than surrender it, in a final gesture that echoed his earlier destruction of his own privateer fleet before Jackson's arrival, a man who seemed to understand instinctively when to abandon a position rather than defend it to ruin. After that, the trail grows fainter still, scattered across rumors and fragments. A sighting here, a ship's log there, stories of a final voyage, a fever, a burial at sea, none of them quite substantial enough to constitute certainty, all of them substantial enough to keep the questions alive. It is precisely here, at the point where the documents fall silent, that legend begins to gather in their place, filling the space the historical record leaves vacant with speculation that has proven, over the intervening 2 centuries, considerably more durable than fact. What is known, or believed to be known, is this much, that after the years of privateering along the Texas coast, after the failed colony at Galveston that bore his name for a time and then quietly did not, Jean Lafitte sailed south, and the historical record, which had followed him with reasonable fidelity through the Barataria years and the days of the battle and the uneasy months that came after, begins here to fray at the edges like old rope left too long in salt air. Some accounts place him in the waters off the Yucatan, engaged still in the only trade he had ever truly mastered, moving between islands that offered no flag any particular loyalty, dealing in goods whose origins were better left unexamined. Other accounts, no less confident in their telling, place him in Mexico itself, on land rather than water, an aging man who had traded the deck for solid ground and taken up some quieter occupation that history has declined to specify with any precision. And still other accounts, whispered more than written, suggest he never truly left the sea at all, that he died as he had lived, somewhere beyond the reach of any customs house or court, his body given to the water that had made him and unmade every rival who had tried to claim him. The most commonly repeated version, the one that has traveled furthest and worn smoothest with repetition, holds that Lafitte died sometime in 1823, felled by fever aboard one of his own vessels off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, and that his crew, following whatever rites were customary among men who had spent their lives outside the reach of any church, committed him to the sea rather than to any consecrated ground. It is a fitting story, in its way, a man who had never quite belonged to any nation being given, in the end, to the one element that had never asked him for his loyalty. But fitting is not the same as verified. And the historians who have chased this particular thread for 2 centuries now will tell you, if pressed, that the evidence supporting it is thinner than the story's popularity would suggest. There is no ship's log preserved that confirms it. There is no witness whose account survived in any form more substantial than second-hand report, passed from sailor to sailor, and eventually to the pens of writers who found the tale too good to interrogate too closely. Other researchers, working from different fragments, have argued for a longer life, that Lafitte did not die in 1823 at all, but lived on for years afterward, under some other name, in some other port, a man who had spent his whole career becoming difficult to trace, and who applied that same skill, in the end, to his own disappearance. There are family histories, particularly in parts of the American South and in Mexico, that claim descent from Lafitte through lines that stretch forward from a supposed later marriage, a supposed later life lived quietly enough that no customs officer or naval patrol ever thought to note it. These claims cannot be dismissed outright, not entirely, because the absence of proof against them is itself a kind of small opening, and Lafitte's entire life had been constructed from precisely such openings. The gaps in enforcement, the seams between jurisdictions, the spaces where one authority's attention ended and another's had not yet begun. A man skilled at exploiting those gaps in commerce might reasonably have been skilled at exploiting them in the matter of his own biography as well. For 200 years now, this uncertainty has drawn a particular kind of attention, the sort that does not diminish with time, but seems instead to compound. Generation after generation, finding in Lafitte's vanishing an invitation rather than a conclusion. Historians have combed archives in New Orleans, Galveston, Mexico City, and Havana, searching customs records and court documents and the scattered private correspondence of men who might once have known him, hoping to find some definitive final entry, a death recorded, a grave marked, a widow named. They have found instead only more fragments, more rumors, more accounts that contradict each other in small but telling ways, as though the man himself had arranged even from within the silence of his disappearance for no single version of his ending to prevail over all the others. Treasure hunters have pursued him with an even less scholarly fervor, drawn by the persistent legend that Lafitte, in his years of privateering, had accumulated wealth that he buried rather than spent, caches of gold and silver hidden along the Louisiana and Texas coastlines against some future need that never arrived, but that arrived for someone else entirely. The barrier islands and marshes of the Gulf Coast have been searched, by amateurs and by the more organized sort of expedition alike, for 2 centuries now. Hulls turning over sand that has long since forgotten whatever it might once have concealed, if it concealed anything at all. Some of these hunts have produced nothing but disappointment. A few have produced old coins, old bottles, fragments of ships that may or may not have belonged to Lafitte's fleet, evidence tantalizing enough to fund the next expedition, but never quite conclusive enough to end the search altogether. The treasure, if it ever existed in the form the legends describe, has proven as elusive as the man who supposedly buried it. And it may be that this elusiveness is itself the point, that a legend which resolved itself, which produced its gold and closed its books, would lose something essential in the resolving. Some quality of possibility that keeps drawing searchers back to marshes that have already been searched 100 times before. Alongside the treasure, other legends grew, as they tend to around men who leave behind more silence than record. There were rumors of a journal kept by Lafitte himself that surfaced decades after his presumed death and purported to fill in the very gaps that history had left open. An account in his own hand of where he went and what became of him. This journal, when it appeared in the 20th century in the hands of a family claiming descent from him, was received with a particular mixture of excitement and skepticism that always attends such discoveries. historians eager for anything that might resolve the old questions but wary too, offering precisely the answers that popular imagination had already supplied. The authenticity of this journal remains disputed to this day, argued over by scholars who have found in its pages both details that ring true and details that seem, on closer examination, to belong more to the legend that had grown up around Lafitte than to the man himself, as though the document had been shaped, consciously or not, by the very stories it claimed to correct. And there were the descendants too, families across the Gulf Coast and beyond, who carried his name forward, or claimed some thinner thread of blood connection through daughters and granddaughters whose own histories are harder still to trace. Some of these claims rest on reasonably solid genealogical ground. Others rest on little more than family memory, passed down at kitchen tables for generations, the kind of story that becomes true through repetition, even when the documents that might confirm it have long since been lost or never existed at all. It is worth noting gently that a man who spent his working life obscuring his own paper trail would have left correspondingly little for his descendants, real or claimed, to point to with certainty. The absence is consistent, at least, with the character of the man it surrounds. What emerges from all of this? The conflicting death reports, the treasure hunts that never quite conclude, the disputed journal, a family claims that cannot be proven and cannot quite be dismissed, is a portrait built almost entirely from negative space, a man defined by what cannot be confirmed about him, rather than by what can. This was, perhaps, always the shape of Lafitte's life, even in the years when the record was thickest. He had built his fortune on operating in the gaps between nations, on being useful to Spain and France, and later the United States without ever quite belonging to any of them, on accepting a governor's bounty and a British commodore's gold within the same season. A man who lived his whole career in the space between clear allegiances might reasonably be expected to die there too, in a space between clear accounts, leaving behind not a settled history, but a scattering of possibilities that no single investigator has ever quite managed to gather into one certain shape. There is something almost fitting, in the end, about a grave that was never marked, about a death that resists confirmation in the way that Lafitte himself resisted every attempt throughout his life to pin him down to a single loyalty. The pirate who sold New Orleans its gunpowder and then fought to defend the city that gunpowder had helped save. Smuggler who was pardoned and then wanted again within the same handful of years. The man who built an empire out of ambiguity left behind, in the end. Only more ambiguity, no headstone in any cemetery that historians have been able to verify, no final entry in any customs house ledger, no witnessed passing that satisfied the requirements of certainty. The sea that had carried his ships through 2 decades of chases and close escape seems, in this final accounting, to have simply closed back over him the way water closes over anything, leaving the surface as smooth and unremarkable as it had been before he ever sailed across it. It may be that this is simply how some lives end, not with the neat closure that later storytellers would prefer, but with a slow fading into rumor, the documented facts giving way gradually to legend, until it becomes difficult to say where the man ends and the myth begins. Some voyages, after all, do not conclude with a known harbor or a marked wreck. Some simply sail on past the edge of what anyone recorded, and the sea, keeping its own counsel as it always has, declines to say where they went. The battlefield at Chalmette lies quiet, now has lain quiet, for longer than anyone still living can remember it otherwise. Grass grows there in the ordinary way that grass grows, indifferent to what it covers. And in spring, the ground softens and greens, without any apparent memory of the mud that once sucked at boot heels and gun carriages, without any visible trace of the blood that soaked into it on a January morning, when the world briefly narrowed to smoke and sound and the terrible arithmetic of grape shot fired into advancing lines. A visitor walking the grounds today finds monuments, plaques, the careful signage of a national park, the low earthworks reconstructed to suggest where the American line once stood. The Mississippi still curves past in its patient brown way, carrying its silt toward a gulf that has not changed its shape appreciably in 2 centuries, though everything that once moved upon it has long since gone. Tour groups pass through in the slow shuffle of people reading placards, children more interested in the cannons than the history the cannons represent, and above it all the sky does what skies do, indifferent to the fact that something enormous once happened. Here and then, having happened, simply stopped happening, leaving only the ground itself as witness. And the ground does not speak. It is worth pausing here at the end to consider what Lafitte's strange arc actually adds up to, if it adds up to anything at all beyond the sum of its documented parts. He was an outlaw before he was anything else the record allows us to see clearly. A man who ran contraband through the marshes of Barataria and sold what the law said he should not sell, who built an operation of considerable sophistication out of the simple fact that New Orleans wanted goods. He was, by any strict reading of the statutes under which he operated, a criminal, and the government that eventually pardoned him had every legal justification for hanging him instead. And yet he became, in the space of a few crowded weeks, something the ledgers had no category for. A patriot, if that word can be stretched to cover a man whose patriotism arrived wrapped in self-interest. A defender of a city that had spent years trying to arrest him. A supplier of flints and powder to an army that could not have fought without them. Then, having been pardoned, having been thanked, having watched his name appear in newspapers in something other than a warrant, he became an exile again, drifting back to the old trades in the old ways, as though the interlude of legitimacy had been a costume he wore for the length of a battle. And finally he became a legend, which is to say he became something larger and vaguer than any of the things he had actually been. A name attached to buried treasure and midnight rescues, and 100 stories that cannot be verified and were never meant to be. The raw material of a country's hunger for outlaws who turn out when the moment demands it. To be something more, what does a life like that reveal? If it reveals anything, perhaps only this, that loyalty in the world Lafitte inhabited was never quite the fixed and simple thing that later tellings would prefer it to be. He was loyal to Barataria, to the men who worked under him, to the intricate economy he had built out of contraband and silence. He was not obviously loyal to the United States, which had shown him mainly suspicion and the threat of the gallows, nor to Spain, whose colonies he preyed upon under letters of marque that were themselves of uncertain legality, nor to Britain, whose gold he accepted before declining its terms. His loyalty, such as it was, seems to have run toward survival, first, and toward the survival of his own enterprise second, and only distantly and conditionally toward any flag or cause beyond that. And yet, when the moment came, when Jackson's need and Lafitte's interest happened to align, he acted with what looked, from a certain distance, exactly like patriotism. The flints delivered, the gunners supplied, the Baratarians standing their ground under artillery fire that would have scattered less disciplined men. Whether this constitutes loyalty in any deep sense, or simply the fortunate alignment of a smuggler's interests with a nation's needs at one particular moment in history, is a question the record cannot settle, and perhaps was never meant to settle. Lafitte himself left no confession on the matter, no diary entry explaining his own motives to posterity. He left only actions, and actions, unlike words, can be read in more than one direction at once. This is perhaps the deepest truth his story leaves behind, that the line between hero and criminal, between the servant of empire and the rebel against it, between civil order and the sea's own older lawlessness, was never so clean as the monuments and the school books would like it to be. New Orleans itself was a city built on that same blurred line, a place where French law and Spanish law and American law had each in turn claimed authority over a population that had learned, out of necessity, to regard all such claims with a certain practical skepticism. The merchants who bought Lafitte's smuggled goods were not criminals in their own eyes, only customers taking advantage of favorable prices. The officials who tolerated his operation for years before Claiborne's crackdown were not corrupt in any simple sense. Only pragmatic men governing a frontier port where rigid enforcement of distant laws made little sense against the realities of the ground. Jackson himself, arriving to defend a city under martial law, imposing order through means that were themselves of questionable legality, bending the rules of engagement and diplomacy to serve the larger end of victory, was hardly a stranger to the same blurred territory Lafitte occupied. Empire and rebellion, it turns out, are not always opposite poles, but sometimes simply different names for the same ambition, viewed from different sides of the ledger. The British saw Lafitte as a potential ally against American authority. The Americans saw him as a potential defense against British invasion. Lafitte saw in both an opportunity to preserve what he had built, and acted according to that calculation without much apparent concern for which side history would eventually credit him with serving. The sea, after all, had never recognized these distinctions to begin with. It received smugglers and naval officers with the same indifferent tide, drowned patriots and pirates in the same water, and offered no verdict on which of them had been in the right. If there is a final image that this whole long voyage settles into, it is not the battlefield, not the courtroom, not even the harbour at Galveston, where his ships once rode at anchor before that too, burned and emptied and returned to marsh and silence. It is instead the older water, the bayous and inlets of Barataria themselves, moonlit now as they were, moonlit then, the same channels that once hid 100 vessels riding low with contraband, the same grasses that once concealed men moving cargo by lantern light in the hours before dawn. Those waters lie still tonight, as they lie still on most nights, unbothered by any vessel larger than a fishing boat, the marsh grass bending in a wind that carries no more cargo than the scent of salt and mud. If a boat crossed there now, at this late hour, it would find nothing to mark what once happened along those banks. No ruin, no plaque, no sunken hull breaking the surface to remind a passing hull of what these waters once concealed. The moon lays its long, pale road across the water exactly as it always has. Indifferent to the centuries, and the marsh keeps its own patient counsel, absorbing every story that passed through it and giving back nothing but reflection and stillness. It is a fitting resting place for a man who himself resisted every attempt to fix him in a single frame. Smuggler, patriot, exile, legend, each identity dissolving into the next, the moment anyone tried to hold it still, until finally even his death dissolved into rumor, and the record itself grew as quiet as the water that had first hidden him. And so the story ends here, not with an answer, but with an image, which is perhaps the more honest way to end any story, this old and this blurred by time. The cannon smoke that once hung low over the fields at Calumet, dispersed within hours of the battle's end, carried off by the same wind that carries everything eventually, and the silence that followed it has lasted, with only the occasional intrusion of tourists and traffic, for 200 years. Somewhere beneath that silence, if the old stories are to be trusted even partially, lie flints and ledgers and perhaps bones that no one has ever troubled to find, resting in mud that has long since stopped keeping track of what it holds. If you found this voyage into forgotten waters restful, there are other lost ships and vanished names waiting quietly on this channel. Other stories of the sea's old business, with human ambition, ready whenever you would like to drift toward them. For now, though, let the marsh keep its silence. Let the moonlight lie unbroken on the water and let yourself rest